In the autumn of 1559, Maria de Bahores stood before the Inquisitorial Tribunal in Seville. An educated woman who had dared to read scripture in her native tongue. She now faced accusations that would lead her through every horror the Spanish Inquisition had perfected. Her story, preserved in meticulous records, provides a window into a machinery of terror that specifically targeted women who stepped beyond their prescribed boundaries. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, quickly evolved from a tool of religious conformity into an instrument of gender oppression. While men certainly suffered under its judgments, women faced unique vulnerabilities. They could not legally defend themselves. Their testimony held less weight than men's, and the nature of their accusations often centered on crimes only women could commit. Witchcraft was linked to female sexuality. Heretical practices were connected to domestic spaces and the corruption of children through mother's milk tainted by false belief. The arrest always came at dawn. Inquisitorial guards knew that darkness amplified terror. Women taken from their beds while children screamed and husbands stood powerless created maximum psychological impact. Maria de Bohawkes was dragged from her home as neighbors watched from behind shuttered windows, learning through her example the price of intellectual curiosity. Her books were burned in the street, her property immediately confiscated. Her children were left to wonder if they would ever see their mother again. The journey to the inquisitorial prison began the torture long before any formal interrogation. Women were transported in open carts, displayed as warnings to others. Crowds threw refuse and stones blessed by priests who assured them that violence against heretics was holy work. By the time Maria reached the prison, her dignity was already under assault, her identity transforming from respected widow to accused heretic. The cells of the Inquisition were designed as instruments of psychological destruction. No light penetrated the stone walls except what leaked through the door's Judas hole. The silence was absolute, except for distant screams that served as a preview of coming attractions. Women spent months in these tombs, their sanity eroding in darkness while they waited for interrogations that might never come. The uncertainty itself was torture, not knowing the charges, the evidence, or even the day of the week. When interrogation finally came, it followed patterns refined over decades of practice. The inquisitors, educated men who saw themselves as physicians of the soul, approached women with a mixture of paternalism and contempt. They believed females were naturally weaker, more susceptible to Satan's influence, and therefore required special methods to extract truth. The questioning began gently, almost kindly, offering chances for voluntary confession. But behind the inquisitors, always visible, stood the instruments that would be employed if words failed. The Spanish Inquisition had inherited medieval torture techniques, but refined them into a science. Manuals specified exact procedures, documenting which tortures produced which types of confessions. The goal was not death, but submission, broken bodies that would confess publicly, validating the Inquisition's authority. Women's bodies, already considered dangerous and polluting in medieval theology, became laboratories where pain was calibrated to produce maximum suffering without martyrdom. The economic dimension cannot be ignored. The Inquisition funded itself through confiscated property, creating incentives to target wealthy widows and successful merchant women. Maria Deborah had inherited substantial property from her late husband, property that would fund months of inquisitorial operations. The intersection of gender, wealth, and religious suspicion made certain women irresistible targets. The strappado was often the first formal torture applied. Its simplicity hid sophisticated cruelty. Maria de Jorge would have been taken to a chamber where ropes hung from ceiling pulleys like nooses waiting for necks. The process began with ritual humiliation. She was stripped to her shift, her hair bound up to expose her neck, her dignity systematically destroyed before the physical pain began. The torturer, often a layman employed specifically for this purpose, would tie her wrists behind her back with rough rope that cut into skin. The rope was attached to the pulley system, and then with mechanical precision, Maria would be hoisted into the air. Her entire body weight, approximately 130 pounds, would suddenly hang from shoulders twisted backward into an anatomically impossible position. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Both shoulders would dislocate within seconds, the ball joints tearing free from sockets with audible pops. Muscles designed to pull were suddenly forced to support entire body weight in extension. Nerves stretched beyond capacity, sending signals of agony that consumed all thought. Contemporary accounts describe women screaming until their throats bled, though the Inquisition's records merely note the prisoner expressed discomfort. But the basic strapadoo was just the beginning. Weights would be attached to Maria's feet, starting with 25 pounds, increasing to 50, then 100. Each addition multiplied the damage exponentially. The shoulders, already dislocated, would begin to tear free from the body entirely. The spine would compress and stretch simultaneously, creating damage that would last a lifetime. Some women reported feeling their arms beginning to separate from their torsos, held only by skin and sinew. The jerking variation inflicted even greater trauma. Maria would be hoisted to the ceiling, then dropped suddenly, only to be stopped with a jerk just before her feet touched ground. This whiplash effect could tear arms completely from sockets, destroy the delicate structures of the spine, and cause internal injuries that would kill slowly over days or weeks. The technique was reserved for those who maintained innocence despite standard strapadoo sessions. Throughout the torture, a notary recorded everything with bureaucratic precision. Each scream was documented, each plea transcribed, each confession carefully noted with the exact time it was obtained. These records, preserved in archives, reveal the systematic nature of the torture. Women like Maria would initially maintain innocence, then begin offering small confessions, eventually admitting to anything suggested just to make the pain stop. The inquisitors understood the psychology of progressive torture. After an hour of strapadoo, Maria would be lowered and asked to confirm her confession. If she recanted, claiming the confession was forced, the torture would resume. This cycle could continue for days, with rest periods calculated to allow just enough recovery to ensure survival for more torture. The goal was to break not just the body but the will, creating confessions that would be maintained even after the torture ended. Maria de Bahores endured 3 sessions of strapadoo over 2 weeks. The records note that she confessed to reading prohibited books discussing theology with other women and questioning the authority of the church. What the records don't capture is that she never walked properly again, never could lift her arms above her shoulders, never could hold her grandchildren without pain shooting through her destroyed joints. The iron spider represented a specifically gendered form of torture designed exclusively for women's bodies. When Maria de Bahores continued to minimize her crimes despite the strapadoo, the inquisitors turned to this device that attacked both flesh and female identity. The spider was brought out with ceremony, heated in braziers until the metal glowed, filling the chamber with the smell of hot iron that would forever trigger panic in survivors. The device consisted of sharp iron claws that could be heated to searing temperatures. Unlike other tortures that were theoretically gender-neutral, the spider was applied exclusively to breasts, targeting the physical markers of womanhood. The symbolism was deliberate. Women accused of nursing heretical beliefs would have their capacity to nurse literally torn away. The breast, symbol of motherhood and feminine nurture, became the site of ultimate violation. The ritual of application was carefully orchestrated psychological torture. Maria would be restrained on a table, her upper body exposed, while male guards, torturers, and inquisitors observed. The heated spider would be held close enough for her to feel its heat, to understand what was coming. This anticipation, sometimes lasting an hour or more, often broke women who had withstood other tortures. The imagination of coming pain proved as powerful as pain itself. When applied, the heated claws would simultaneously burn and penetrate, creating wounds that combined multiple types of agony. The metal would sear nerve endings while tearing through tissue, creating damage that would never fully heal. The spider would then be slowly pulled away, ripping flesh in a controlled manner that maximized pain while avoiding immediately fatal damage. Women described the sensation as having their essence as females literally torn from their bodies. The psychological impact exceeded even the physical trauma. In a society where women's value centered on their roles as wives and mothers, the deliberate mutilation of breasts constituted identity destruction. Many survivors reported feeling they were no longer truly women after the spider's application. Some could never nurse children, others were rejected by husbands who saw them as damaged, and all carried scars that marked them as women who had been tortured by the Inquisition. The spider was particularly used against women accused of sexual crimes. Adultery linked to heresy, fornication with devils, or the sexual aspects of witchcraft allegations. The Inquisitors created a logic where the punishment matched the crime, where women who had allegedly used their sexuality for evil would have that sexuality literally torn away. This revealed the deep sexual anxieties underlying much of the Inquisition's persecution of women. Contemporary accounts from physicians who examined spider victims describe horrific damage, massive scarring, chronic infections, and permanent disfigurement. Many women developed what would now be recognized as complex regional pain syndrome, experiencing burning agony years after the torture. The spider's wounds were designed to heal slowly, keeping victims in pain for months while preventing the death that would end their suffering and their use as examples. The rack or potro transformed the human body into an instrument of its own destruction. When Maria de Bahores refused to name accomplices despite previous tortures, she was brought to this device that would systematically disassemble her body's structural integrity. The Spanish rack had been refined from its medieval predecessors into a precise instrument that could maintain victims at the exact threshold between agony and death. The device dominated torture chambers, a wooden frame with rollers at each end, leather straps, and windlasses that created mechanical advantage, allowing one man to tear apart a human body with minimal effort. Maria would be laid on the frame, leather straps attached to wrists and ankles, with additional bonds across her chest and thighs, ensuring no movement was possible. Her hair would be tied to the frame, preventing any head movement that might provide relief. The initial positioning was carefully calculated. The body would be stretched just enough to remove all slack, creating discomfort, but not immediate pain. At this stage, many women broke, understanding what was coming and choosing confession over the inevitable agony. Maria held firm, perhaps still believing her influential friends might intervene. She would learn that the rack recognized no social distinctions. As the windlasses turned, Maria's body began its transformation. First, the sensation of muscles stretching beyond their design limits, thousands of microfibers tearing in a cascade of pain signals. Then joints began to separate. Fingers first, then wrists, elbows, shoulders. The spine, that crucial architecture of human uprightness, would begin to elongate, spaces appearing between vertebrae. Hip joints would start their slow dislocation, followed by knees and ankles. The human body was never meant to be 6 inches longer than its natural height. The rack's operators were skilled professionals who understood anatomy. They knew that turning the windlass 1/4 rotation might separate joints without full dislocation, maintaining the victim in unbearable anticipation of the final destructive turn. They could keep Maria suspended in this pre-dislocation agony for hours, her body trembling with the effort of holding itself together against mechanical forces that would inevitably win. The sounds the rack produced were as traumatic as the pain itself. Witnesses described the pop of separating joints, the crack of cartilage tearing, the wet sound of muscles ripping from bone. These sounds carried through prison walls, ensuring other prisoners understood what awaited them. Maria's screams would join a chorus that echoed through the Inquisition's chambers, each voice a lesson to others about the price of resistance. Between stretching sessions, Maria would be questioned. The inquisitors wanted names. Who else read forbidden books? Which women gathered to discuss theology? Who questioned church authority? The rack was particularly effective at producing accusations against others, as victims desperately offered names to stop their bodies from being torn apart. These extracted accusations would trigger new arrests, creating chains of persecution that could destroy entire communities of educated women. The pair of anguish embodied the Inquisition's ability to inflict invisible torture that left no external marks while destroying women from within. When Maria de Bahores proved resistant to external tortures, maintaining that her confessions were limited to personal failings rather than organized heresy, the inquisitors turned to this device that would violate her internally, where no witness could observe the damage. The pair was an iron device shaped like its namesake fruit when closed, consisting of 4 segments that could be expanded by turning a screw. Different sizes existed for different orifices: mouth, vagina, and anus, with the chosen location corresponding to the alleged crime. For Maria, accused of speaking heresy, the oral version would be employed, though the threat of other applications hung heavy in the torture chamber's air. The insertion itself constituted assault. Maria would be held down while the cold metal was forced into her mouth, the taste of iron mixing with terror. The initial position was merely uncomfortable, the closed pair filling her mouth but not preventing breathing through her nose. But as the screw began to turn, the segments would slowly separate, stretching her jaw beyond its natural capacity, pressing against teeth, palate, and throat. The expansion continued incrementally, each turn of the screw precisely calibrated. The corners of Maria's mouth would begin to tear, blood running down her throat. Her jaw joints would strain, then begin to dislocate. Teeth might crack under pressure. The soft tissues of her mouth would stretch and tear. Breathing became difficult as the expanding metal pressed against her airway. Panic would mix with pain as suffocation threatened. The pair's particular cruelty lay in its invisibility. Unlike external tortures that left obvious marks, the pair's damage was hidden inside the body. Maria could be displayed at her auto-da-fe, looking relatively intact, while suffering from internal injuries that would never heal. She might never eat solid food again, never speak without pain, never swallow without remembering the metal's expansion in her throat. For women accused of sexual crimes, the pair took on even more horrific dimensions. A vaginal insertion was used against those accused of fornication with devils or the sexual aspects of witchcraft. These applications caused massive internal trauma, tearing of vaginal walls, damage to the cervix and uterus, injuries that would make intercourse impossible and pregnancy deadly. The Inquisition thus ensured that women accused of sexual crimes would never again be able to engage in sexuality, even within marriage. The psychological impact of the pair exceeded its physical damage. The violation of internal spaces, the loss of bodily integrity from within, created dissociative states that many never recovered from. Women reported feeling that their bodies had become alien territories, violated in ways that destroyed their sense of self. The internal nature of the damage meant they carried invisible wounds that no one else could see or understand. The judgment chair stood in the torture chamber like a throne of thorns, its surface bristling with hundreds of iron spikes. When Maria de Bahores continued to protect other women despite previous tortures, she was brought before this device that would make sitting, that most basic human position, into prolonged agony. The chair represented the Inquisition's understanding that sometimes the simplest tortures were the most effective. The chair's construction was precisely engineered, with between 500 and 1,500 spikes of varying lengths, Every surface of the chair was covered. The seat, the back, the armrests, and even the footrests. Each spike was crafted with precision, long enough to pierce skin and muscle, but not so long as to touch vital organs. Their spacing was deliberate, ensuring the victim's weight could never be evenly spread. Instead, unbearable force pressed into specific pressure points. Maria would be stripped and then lowered slowly onto those spikes, while inquisitors calmly explained that her torment could end instantly if she gave a full confession. The first moment of contact delivered hundreds of puncture wounds at once. Any single one might have been bearable, but together, the pain was overwhelming. Blood began to seep immediately, but not in volumes enough to kill her quickly. This was not a device of mercy. It was engineered to torture, not to grant release. Iron bands locked tight around Maria's wrists and ankles, preventing any chance of movement. More straps across her chest and thighs sealed her in place. She could not shift, could not adjust her body to ease the pain. Every instinct to move, to search for comfort, became its own trap, her body betraying her with involuntary motions that only drove the spikes deeper. The chair's cruelty unfolded over time. First came the shock of puncture wounds. Then, as hours passed, swelling set in, increasing the pressure on every spike. Blood pooled in her lower limbs, causing yet more swelling. Cramps twisted her immobilized muscles. Eventually, infection crept in, fevers rising, interpreted by the inquisitors as proof that demons were leaving her body. And then came fire. Braziers beneath the chair slowly heated the iron, transforming spikes into glowing needles. The warmth rose in stages. First a dull heat, then discomfort, then searing agony. Maria's flesh began to cook where it touched metal, the chamber filling with the stench of burning skin. The cruelest part was that the heat cauterized wounds as it created them, stopping blood loss while maximizing pain. Some chairs added refinements. Spikes on the armrests pressed into the tender flesh of the inner arms. Footrest spikes angled to keep weight off the legs. Adjustable backs allowed inquisitors to shift pressure points, preventing even the faintest adaptation. What had once been sitting was turned into an art of suffering. But the chair was only one tool. The tokai, the Inquisition's water torture, twisted life's most essential element into an instrument of suffocation. Maria de Bohores, already broken by previous torment, now faced this ordeal. The sensation of drowning without ever touching open water. The torture left no marks, allowing inquisitors to claim mercy. But the psychological scars would last a lifetime. The preparation itself felt ritualistic. Bound to an inclined table, Maria's head was forced lower than her feet. Blood surged toward her brain, making her dizzy, panicked. An iron device pried her mouth open, sometimes the very same used for other torments. A cloth, the tueur that gave this torture its name, was laid across her face, covering both nose and mouth. Water poured slowly from above, soaking the cloth until it clung to her like a suffocating mask. Each trickle forced its way into her nostrils and mouth, triggering the drowning reflex. She convulsed with the desperate need to breathe, but the soaked fabric made it impossible. The sensation was drowning in reverse, water entering her body while air remained out of reach. The inquisitors had perfected their methods. Water was measured in jars carefully rationed to match resistance. 6 jars for the first session, 8 for the second, 12 if the victim still protected others. Between each round, Maria gasped for air, knowing another flood was coming. Anticipation itself became torture. The damage was deep, even if unseen. Water flooding the sinuses caused excruciating pain and permanent injury. The drowning reflex, triggered again and again, could throw the heart into deadly arrhythmia. Sometimes water slipped into the lungs, causing pneumonia that killed victims days later. And for survivors, the trauma was lifelong. water forever tied to death, so that even washing one's face could spark terror. The cruelty grew darker when inflicted on pregnant women. The violent convulsions often triggered miscarriage. Inquisitors claimed to protect unborn children, yet accused women who miscarried of murdering their babies to deny them the true faith. Their grief was twisted into evidence of guilt. After months of torment, Maria faced her final fate, the auto de fe, a public ceremony where the Inquisition staged its power with choreographed humiliation and death. These spectacles drew thousands, stretching across entire days. What had been private agony would now become public spectacle. The night before, the procession of the Green Cross wound through the prison. Guards announced sentences. Maria learned she would be relaxed to the secular arm, the euphemism for burning alive. Priests urged her to confess, promising that repentance would earn her the mercy of strangulation before the flames. Pride or faith, we will never know which, made her refuse. At dawn, she was dressed in the San Benito, a yellow garment painted with flames pointing upward, marking her sentence. A pointed cap, the carroza, bore the same decoration. Together, they erased her as a person, transforming her into nothing but a symbol. The heretic. The procession wound through crowded streets. Maria, barefoot and frail from months of torture, stumbled along. Those too broken to walk were carried or dragged. Bodies paraded as trophies of the Inquisition's might. Spectators hurled stones and refused, urged on by priests who declared their cruelty holy. The plaza was dominated by a massive scaffold. Platforms held inquisitors, officials, and the condemned. For hours Maria stood while sermons rang out. Warnings about heresy, praises of the Church's mercy, justifications for her death. Her confessions, ripped from her under torture, were read aloud, laced with lurid inventions. Forbidden books, imagined orgies, devil worship. Lies woven into humiliation. Finally, came the last walk from scaffold to stake. Some condemned broke here, begging for mercy and confessing in exchange for strangulation. Others, like Maria, held their silence or whispered innocence. The crowd shifted between bloodlust and pity. Sympathy, however, was dangerous. Anyone moved by her suffering risked suspicion of heresy themselves. At the stake, Maria was chained to the post high on a platform, visible to all. The pyre was built of green wood, chosen to smolder before burning, dragging the torment out. As the smoke thickened and flames rose, some claimed Maria began to pray, whether to the God of her inquisitors, or to her own understanding of the divine. No one could say. Her screams echoed across the city, one more voice in the endless chorus of the auto de fe. Not every woman perished this way. Some confessed. Some had influence. A rare few simply endured beyond their torturers' expectations. These survivors carried their stories into the world. Fragile, secret testimonies that slipped past suppression. Their words preserved the truth, not only of horror, but of resistance, of endurance, and of the unbreakable fragments of humanity that even fire could not consume. And then came the limits of even the Inquisition's power. Isabella Duna represented one path to survival: strategic confession. Arrested for Judaizing in 1561, she quickly understood the rules. Complete denial meant certain death, while complete confession meant dragging others down with her. So she built a strategy. She admitted to her own practices, but claimed ignorance of their heretical nature. She played into the expectations of female weakness, even fainting during mild questioning to avoid harsher tortures. Her confessions were detailed enough to satisfy her interrogators, yet vague enough to shield others. The physical aftermath of torture left scars that lasted a lifetime. Women emerged from inquisitorial prisons with ruined joints from the strappado, torn insides from the pear, and chronic pain from the rack. Tasks once simple became impossible. Cooking required hands strong enough to grip, Childcare demanded arms able to lift. Survival itself depended on a body that worked. Many women could no longer manage. Families, burdened with caring for survivors whose torture had brought shame and poverty, often resented them. Economic survival was equally bleak. The Inquisition's confiscation of property left even acquitted women destitute. The Sambenito worn during public penance had to be displayed permanently in parish churches, creating records that followed them forever. A woman marked this way became unemployable, unmarriageable, and often homeless. Some survived by begging, others by prostitution. Grim irony for those punished for supposed moral crimes. Yet psychological adaptation revealed remarkable resilience. Survivors developed what we now call dissociation, separating mind from body during trauma. Many built entire inner worlds where torture could not reach, preserving sanity through vivid mental constructions. Some described watching their own suffering from above, detached, almost as though it were happening to someone else. Networks of mutual aid formed, dangerous but vital. Women who had survived secretly guided new victims' families, whispering which inquisitors showed the rarest glimpses of mercy, which confessions would satisfy without implicating others, which tortures might be endured, and which broke every soul. This underground education passed quietly at markets and wells, forming an invisible resistance that preserved both lives and minds. Some survivors became secret chroniclers. Luisa de Carvajal, tortured in Mexico City's Inquisition, hid coded accounts in the margins of prayer books. Maria de Azala preserved testimonies in embroidery, weaving evidence into patterns of thread. These alternative archives, passed through female networks the Inquisition did not deem threatening, carried forward records that official documents tried to erase. The Spanish Inquisition officially ended in 1834. But its methods, justifications, and impact stretched forward into the centuries and into our present. The systematic torture of women under religious authority created patterns that resurfaced in new guises. Different ideologies, yes, but always the same fundamental structure. Women's bodies as battlegrounds for power and control. The bureaucratization of torture pioneered by the Inquisition became a template for modern authoritarian regimes. Meticulous documentation, medical supervision to prolong survival, reliance on confession instead of evidence, all resurfaced in the 20th century. The Argentine dictatorship's systematic torture of female prisoners, including pregnant women, echoed inquisitorial practices with chilling precision. The link between sexual violence and ideological persecution, forged by the Inquisition, continues worldwide. Women accused of witchcraft in parts of contemporary Africa and Asia face tortures uncannily similar to those endured by Maria de Bahores. Accusations of wielding supernatural powers, corrupting communities, threatening order. The responses remain consistent. Public humiliation, sexualized torture, burning, medical complicity, normalized by inquisitorial physicians, set a precedent for atrocities centuries later. Nazi doctors experimenting on women, psychiatrists prescribing electroshock to cure female independence, modern physicians performing forced sterilizations. Each case followed the same pattern. Medical authority twisted into a tool of oppression. Even today, legal systems echo inquisitorial shadows. The obsession with confession over evidence, the dismissal of women's credibility, the practice of dragging past sexual history into trials to discredit victims. Women reporting sexual violence face interrogations that mirror inquisitorial questioning. Their credibility doubted, their histories examined, their pain minimized. The destruction of women's knowledge networks during the Inquisition left voids that remain. Traditional medicine once practiced by women was displaced by male-dominated professional medicine. Female literacy, long deemed dangerous, was suppressed. Women's gatherings, feared as potential sites of heresy, were discouraged or outlawed. These systematic attacks left gaps in knowledge and community that societies are still struggling to repair. Contemporary religious fundamentalism, regardless of faith, often revives inquisitorial patterns. Women who challenge religious authority, who speak of spiritual experiences beyond sanctioned boundaries, who claim autonomy over their bodies and minds, face persecution echoing Maria de Bohores' ordeal. The faiths may differ, but the structure remains constant. Male authority enforcing control through violence. Understanding the torture of women under the Inquisition is not merely a historical exercise. It is a pressing necessity. The patterns established then, the intersection of misogyny and ideology, the use of sexual violence as control, the corruption of protective institutions, still threaten women worldwide. Maria de Bohores died in 1559, but women continue to burn, literally and figuratively, for the crime of existing beyond prescribed limits. The Inquisition failed in its stated goal of enforcing religious unity through terror. What it did succeed in creating was generational trauma, destroyed knowledge, and enduring templates for persecution. Every woman tortured, every family shattered, every community terrorized revealed not the triumph of faith, but its corruption into an instrument of power. The devices of torment, the strappado, the rack, the iron spider, the pear, the chair, were not tools of salvation, but weapons of oppression, showing how far human cruelty could sink when cloaked in sacred language. As we remember Maria de Bohores and the countless women whose names were erased, we must recognize their suffering was not inevitable. It was chosen by men who placed power above compassion, orthodoxy above humanity, control above justice. Their stories demand more than remembrance. They demand vigilance. In a world where women still face violence for reading, thinking, healing, and speaking, the Inquisition's chambers are not relics of the past. They remain dangerously relevant. The last words belong not to the inquisitors, who documented their tortures with bureaucratic pride, but to the women who endured them. Most voices were silenced, but fragments survive. Maria de Bohores, before her execution, is said to have declared, "I die for reading words that men feared I might understand." In that sentence lies both the tragedy of her death and the threat she embodied. A woman claiming the right to her own mind, her own faith, her own understanding. That threat, which the Inquisition tried to reduce to ashes, survived the flames. And it survives still,